At the intersection of two abandoned highways stood a half-forgotten hotel, which in recent years has turned into a cheap overnight stay for truckers and casual tourists. No one asked unnecessary questions, because the guests stayed here only for one night. The hotel was not in the best condition. Cracked walls, peeling paint, and a musty smell in the rooms. But the owners didn't care, because their business was not for the convenience of customers. Door number 17 was closed a long time ago. No one knew why she wasn't turned in, but there were rumors. Some said that one day a guest disappeared there. Others claimed that things were happening in the room that could not be explained. In fact, number 17 was not just closed, it was disguised. The door was removed, and the opening was sewn up with a wall. However, fragments of the past rarely disappear without a trace. The police had already checked this place once after a missing person, but no evidence could be found. The owner of the hotel confidently replied that number 17 had never existed, and all suspicions were just speculation. But for these words, he received a round sum, and was not bothered anymore. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, a group of young people were heading to rest. These were four friends who had been linked for many years of friendship. John, the leader of the company, who loves to organize everything. Leah, a restrained but determined girl. Mark, a joker who never took anything seriously. And Caitlin, modest and a little withdrawn, but devoted to her friends. Their route was simple. Drive through several towns, explore local attractions, and enjoy nature. But the road suddenly changed their plans. Late evening, heavy rain, lack of communication. They found themselves in a situation where they urgently needed to find a place to stay. The only place nearby turned out to be that very hotel. "It'll do," John said, curling his lips when they saw the building. Inside, everything looked even worse. Dust, dim lights, and a receptionist who didn't even raise his head to greet them. "Are there rooms?" Leah asked. "Two," the administrator said shortly, without looking at them. He gave them the keys to rooms 16 and 18. "What about number 17? Mark suddenly asked, trying to add lightness to the atmosphere. The administrator looked up. His gaze was long, as if he was choosing his words. "It doesn't work," he replied. Friends did not insist. They split into pairs and went to their rooms. The rain continued to drum on the roof, and the hotel seemed frozen in time. But that night, no one could sleep peacefully. Leah and Caitlin, who were in the same room, heard a strange screeching coming from the wall separating them from room 17. "Probably rats," Leah suggested, covering her ears with a pillow. Mark and John were trying to plug in the charger in room 18 at the time, but the electricity went out as soon as they approached the outlet. "Old wiring," John said, although his voice sounded uncertain. But the most eerie thing was that in both rooms they heard the same sound, a low whisper that grew louder every hour. In the morning they met at the exit, barely waiting for dawn. "This place is cursed," Mark joked, although no one smiled. They were about to leave, but found that their car was not there. "What the hell?" shouted John. "Maybe a tow truck?" suggested Caitlin uncertainly. "A tow truck? Here, look around you." He pointed to the empty fields and forest. They returned to the hotel, but the receptionist had already disappeared. There was only a note on the counter. "Stay in your rooms. They're on their way." John grabbed the note and read it aloud again, as if trying to figure out if it was a joke or not. His fingers were trembling, and the others just stood there, startled by the words. "This is some kind of prank," Mark said quickly, but even he couldn't hide his concern. "What are they like?" "What does this mean?" asked Leah, feeling her voice tremble treacherously. Caitlin, the quietest of the group, pointed to the reception desk, where there was another thing, an old key with the number 17. It was covered in rust, and the metal looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "This, from that room? What is it?" she asked, barely breathing. John didn't answer. He just grabbed the key and headed for the locked door. The others followed him, as if magically attracted by this strange find. When they reached the place where the door should have been, Everything looked different. In its place was a wall, smooth, as if freshly painted. "What the—" Mark began, but didn't have time to finish because Leah pointed to something nearby. A thin line, almost imperceptible, ran along the wall, marking a hidden door. John ran his finger along this line and felt the cold metal under the plaster. "It's not just a wall," he said. He inserted the key into the keyhole, which also looked like part of the wall. Everyone held their breath for a second. The key turned with difficulty, but finally clicked. At the same moment, there was a rumble outside the door. A dull, low sound, as if a huge motor had started working. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" asked Caitlin. "No," John replied before pulling the door open. When it opened, they saw a hallway. It was dark, narrow, and bare wires hung from the ceiling, along which sparks sometimes ran. "Someone has obviously invested a lot in this place," Mark chuckled nervously, but no one answered. They went inside. The corridor led down. The floor was made of concrete, but every step made a strange, muffled sound. It was as if there was an empty space underneath him. There were old surveillance cameras on the walls, which slowly turned around, watching them. "This is some kind of secret room," Leah muttered. "A bunker, maybe," John suggested, his voice sounding cold. But the further they went, the stronger the smell became. It was suffocating, chemical, with an admixture of something rotting. They found a door at the end of the corridor. It was metal, with a keypad. There was a piece of paper on the panel with a handwritten code, 4927. "It's too easy," John said, entering the code. When the door opened, they froze. There was a laboratory behind it. The room was filled with glass containers. They contained things that could not be described in one word. Human body parts, strange apparatuses, IVs with clear liquid. There were old screens on the walls where recordings were being made. There were people in the video. They were screaming, trying to break free from the fastenings, but they were being held. Someone injected them with drugs. Someone watched the reaction. "What is this place?" Leah gasped, clutching her head. Caitlin moved closer to one of the containers. There was a hand inside it. Just the hand. She was tied up with wires, and her fingers were moving. "This can't be true," she whispered, backing away. At that moment, one of the doors in the laboratory opened, and people in white coats entered the room. They had masks on their faces, covering everything except their eyes. "We need to leave," John whispered. But it was too late. The white coats noticed them. One of them said something into a walkie-talkie, and soon a group of men in black uniforms, with weapons, entered the laboratory. Mark shouted, but he was roughly grabbed by the arms and thrown to the floor. The others were pinned down just as quickly. "Who are you?" shouted Leah as she was led away through another corridor. There was no answer. The white coats moved without a single word, but their movements were fast, honed, as if they were performing a long-practiced operation. John resisted with all his might, but the grip of the men in black uniforms turned out to be iron. His arms were twisted behind his back, and plastic ties were snapped on his wrists. Leah screamed incoherently until she was dragged by force towards one of the corridors. Mark tried to escape, but he was simply stunned by a blow from the butt, after which he hung limply in the hands of the guards. Caitlin stared at what was happening with her eyes wide with horror, but did not move. She seemed frozen, unable to believe in the reality of what was happening. Two men in black uniforms approached her, grabbed her by the shoulders and dragged her in the same direction as the others. The group split up. Each was taken to a separate corridor, and then they were scattered in different rooms. John found himself in a small windowless room with the only light source, a lamp under the ceiling, which flickered so that his eyes quickly began to tire. He tried to look around, but there was nothing in the room except a metal chair and a camera attached to the corner of the ceiling. They put him on a chair. His hands are still tied. The guards silently left, leaving him alone. John knew he was being watched. The camera turned slowly, locking onto his face. He felt like a trapped mouse, and the thought infuriated him. "What do you need?" he shouted, looking straight at the camera. There was no answer. It seemed like hours had passed. The lamp continued to blink. John tried to stretch the plastic tie around his wrists, but it was too strong. At some point, the door opened and a man in a white coat entered the room. He had a mask on his face and a tablet in his hands. "You will answer the questions," he said, sitting down opposite John. The voice was cold, without emotion. "Where are my friends?" John barked, but the man in the bathrobe ignored him. "Your name?" "What is it?" he asked, glancing at the tablet. "Go to hell," John said through clenched teeth. The man did not answer. He made a note on his tablet, then got up and headed for the door. Hey, stop. What's going on?" John shouted, but the man walked out without deigning to answer him. In the next room, Leah was sitting in exactly the same setting. Her hands were tied, and blood was flowing down her cheek from the blow she received while resisting. She was also left alone under the flickering light, and she was trembling with fear. At some point, she heard a faint noise. Someone was talking in the hallway, but it was impossible to make out the words. The door opened and a man in a white coat entered the room. He was holding a syringe with a clear liquid in his hands. "What is it? What are you going to do?" cried Leah, trying to move away, but the chair was bolted to the floor. The man did not answer. He carefully inserted the needle into her neck and pressed down on the plunger. Leah felt a burning sensation that spread throughout her body. My eyes started to water, and my heart was pounding like crazy. "What are you? Did you do it?" she whispered, feeling her consciousness begin to leave her. The man in the white coat walked out without saying a word. When Leah woke up, she was lying in another room. His hands were free, but there was a strange weakness in his body. Around her, medical instruments, glass containers, and folders with documents lay on tables. She tried to stand up, but her legs were barely moving. Then her gaze fell on one of the folders. Her name was written on the cover. She grabbed the folder and started flipping through the pages. There were notes on them, medical reports, pictures of her body, including MRI and X-rays. Some of the pages were stained with something dark that looked like blood. On the last page she saw the inscription, "The object is ready for the next stage. We are waiting for instructions." Her breathing quickened. What are they going to do? And why is it called an object? In the next room, John continued to shout at the camera until the door opened again. This time 2 people entered, a man in a white coat and a guard. The guard had a taser in his hands. "Will you cooperate?" the man in the bathrobe asked coldly. "Go to hell," barked John. The guard silently tasered him. John cried out in pain, but he didn't break down. His consciousness began to fade, but he swore to himself that he would find a way out. At this time, Mark and Caitlin were also undergoing their trials. They were interrogated, injected with unknown drugs, forced to sign documents that they did not understand. It seemed that each of them had become part of some monstrous experiment, and it was almost impossible to get out of here alive. Now their only hope was to find each other. But could they even trust themselves after all that had been done to them? While John was lying on the cold floor, he heard a quiet noise in the ventilation. At first he thought it was just air, but then the sounds became clearer. Those were the steps. Someone was moving through the ventilation shaft above his room. He strained his ears, trying to figure out if these were his friends. "Leah? Mark? Caitlin?" he whispered, not hoping for an answer. The noise stopped. There was silence for a few seconds, and then the vent cover began to slowly slide away. John froze, tensing, ready for anything. Caitlin crawled out of the vent. Her face was dirty, her hands were scratched, and her eyes were full of fear. "Quiet," she whispered. motioning for him not to make a sound. "How did you get out?" John whispered in surprise. "I heard the guards talking about an emergency exit on the lower level. We need to get out before they start looking for us," Caitlin said, helping John free his hands. He stood up, feeling his body ache with pain. "Have you seen Leah or Mark?" "No." "But we will find them. Come on, there's not much time," she said, looking back at the door. Caitlin pointed to the ventilation passage. "I saw where they were taking Leah. If we can get through the ventilation, maybe we'll find her." John nodded. He knew there was no other way out. Staying here meant death or something much worse. They climbed into the ventilation shaft, trying to move as quietly as possible. The shaft was narrow, and every movement echoed. At one of the turns, they heard voices. John froze, listening. They have been resisting for too long. "Start phase 2, one of the voices said. "What's phase 2? John whispered, but Caitlin just put her finger to her lips, telling him to move on. A few minutes later, they reached the room where they were holding Leah. John looked through the vent and saw her. She was sitting on the floor, holding the folder she had found. His face was pale and his eyes were red from crying. "Leah," he whispered, banging on the bars. She raised her head, at first not understanding where the sound was coming from, but then she noticed them. Relief lit up her face. Caitlin began to unscrew the bolts on the grill while John watched the hallway. As soon as the grate was removed, they helped Leah into the ventilation. "I found the documents. They're doing something terrible. This place is an experimental laboratory. They are conducting experiments on humans," Leah whispered, showing them one of the pages. On the page was a diagram of a human body with notes. Object 17. "The implementation has been completed. Side effects: high aggression, memory loss. We need to get Mark out and get out of here," John said firmly. They continued to move through the ventilation, but soon they heard a noise. People in black uniforms were walking from below. One of them was holding a walkie-talkie. "We have lost 2 objects. They're in the ventilation. Immediately block all exits," he said. "Damn." Caitlin swore. "They know we're here." "Move faster," John said, pointing to another turn. They reached the room where Mark was being held. He was chained to a chair and his face was covered in bruises. A man in a white coat was standing next to him, writing something on a tablet. John didn't wait. He kicked the ventilation grate with all his might, knocking it out, and jumped down. The blow was sharp, but he immediately got up and rushed at the man in the robe, knocking him to the floor. Caitlin and Leah followed him, helping to free Mark. He could barely stand on his feet, but his eyes were burning with rage. "We're not leaving here alive unless we find a weapon," he croaked. John searched the pockets of the fallen man and found a key card. "First we'll find a way out, then we'll think about how to fight back," he said. They ran out into the hallway, but soon they heard sirens. The lights were flashing, and the speakers said, "Critical security level. All units to their posts." "They're driving us into a trap," Leah said. "No. We'll find another way," John replied, gritting his teeth. Now there was only one goal left, to get out of this hellish place. The group ran down the corridor, checking every door on the way. Caitlin carried the key card like a trophy, and Mark, barely able to stand, struggled to keep up. Behind the backs of the friends came the sounds of approaching footsteps, talking on the radio and orders. They turned another corner and found themselves in a room full of computers and servers. The lights were flashing, the equipment was buzzing, and some graphs and data were displayed on the monitors. "Let's hide here," suggested Caitlin, looking around the room. "Shall we hide?" "They'll find us anyway," said John, closing the door. "We can use this equipment," Leah said, pointing to one of the computers. "If we find maps of this building, we can figure out where the emergency exit is." John wasn't sure if it would work, but there was no time to argue. Leah sat down at her computer, frantically tapping on the keys. Her fingers were shaking, but she kept looking for something useful in the systems. "There is," she whispered. "There is a technical tunnel on the 3rd level. It leads outside." "The 3rd level? We don't even know how to get there," Mark said skeptically. Leah looked up and pointed to a door at the end of the room. "The elevator. He has to go down there." At the same moment, footsteps sounded in the hallway. The guards were approaching. John motioned for everyone to stay where they were, then went to the door and peered through the crack. 3 armed men were standing just a few meters away. "We don't have time," he whispered. "Then take this," Caitlin said, opening one of the drawers under the server. There were tools inside, screwdrivers, wrenches, and what looked like a cutter. "Well, at least something," John muttered, grabbing the cutter. They went out into the corridor, trying to move as quietly as possible. Leah was pressed against the wall, clutching the keycard, and Mark was holding a wrench, ready to use it if necessary. The footsteps were getting closer. Suddenly, the door in front of them opened, and 2 guards found themselves face to face with the group. John didn't give them time to react. He rushed at one of them, knocking the weapon out of his hands, and hit him on the helmet with a cutter. At that time, Caitlin tried to cope with the second guard, but she was pushed away and fell to the floor. John shouted, grabbing the weapon that had fallen from the hands of the first guard. He turned around and fired at the second one, knocking him down. The others were shocked, but they didn't waste any time. They ran across the corridor and reached the elevator. Leah pressed the key card to the panel, and the doors opened. "Let's go faster," she shouted as she walked inside. John, Mark, and Caitlin flew into the cabin, and the doors closed. Leah pressed the button with the number -3. The elevator shook and began to descend. "They'll figure out where we are soon," Mark said, breathing heavily. "We need to be ready," John replied, checking the remaining cartridges in the weapon. When the elevator doors opened, they were greeted by utter silence. The 3rd level was dimly lit, and the air here was humid and smelled of mold. The walls were covered with pipes and wires, from which water sometimes dripped. "Where is this tunnel?" asked Caitlin, looking around. Leah took out the paper she had printed the map on and pointed to the left corridor. "There." The group moved forward, but soon heard the noise again. People in black uniforms were coming down after them. The footsteps were getting closer, and a familiar voice came from afar. "Don't let them get away. They pose a threat to the project." "Let's run," said John, pushing Leah forward. The corridors were getting narrower, and finally they reached a large metal door. Leah attached the key card again, but nothing happened. "What's wrong?" Caitlin screamed. "I don't know." "It has to work," panicked Leah, clicking on the panel. "Get out," said John, picking up the cutter. He began to cut the lock, and sparks flew in different directions. The footsteps from behind grew louder. The men in black uniforms were already a few meters away from them. "Hurry up," shouted Mark, turning around. Finally, the lock gave way and the door opened. There was a concrete staircase leading up behind it. "Run," shouted John, letting everyone go ahead. Leah, Caitlin, and Mark ran upstairs, but John paused to block the door behind him. He grabbed a heavy pipe and propped it up, creating a temporary barrier. When they ran to the surface, they were greeted by the cold night air. Leah fell to her knees, breathing heavily. Caitlin turned around, trying to figure out if they were being followed. "We did it," Mark whispered, but his voice was shaking with fatigue. John turned to the group. "It's not over yet. We need to get as far away from here as possible." They were standing at the edge of the forest. The lights of the laboratory could be seen in the distance. But was this night their salvation or the beginning of something much worse? The friends rushed into the forest without looking back. Branches whipped at their faces. The cold wind cut their skin, but no one stopped. Every step was painful, but the fear of being caught forced them to move on. "Where are we going?" asked Leah, panting. "Just get away from this damn lab," John replied, stopping only for a moment to help Mark, who was starting to lag behind. Soon they came to a path that seemed to lead to the road, but the silence of the forest was deceptive. It seemed that someone was watching them behind every tree. John felt it, and it was growing by the minute. "Do you hear that?" Caitlin suddenly asked, stopping. Everyone froze, listening to the rustle of the forest. No voices, just the faintest crackle of branches somewhere far away. But it was enough to make everyone's heart beat faster. "They're after us," Mark whispered. "Stick together," John ordered, clutching the weapon he was still carrying. Leah took out the map she had taken from the lab. There were several roads marked on it, and one of them was supposed to be nearby. "This way," she said, pointing to the east. The group moved in the indicated direction, accelerating their pace. They had been walking for about half an hour when the headlights of a car finally appeared ahead. "There's a road," Caitlin cried out joyfully. But the joy was short-lived. When they ran out to the side of the road, the car, seeing them, braked sharply, and two men got out of it. They were wearing the same black uniforms as the guards. John shouted, grabbing for his weapon. But before he could fire, one of the men raised his hands. "Wait, we are not with them," he shouted. "Why should we believe you?" Caitlin asked, narrowing her eyes. "Because if you don't hurry, they'll find you, and then you're definitely finished," Caitlin asked, looking around in the dim light. Leah picked up the tablet she had grabbed in the server room. A third-level map was flashing on the screen. "This way," she pointed to the left turn. John led the group forward, clutching his weapon. From time to time, they heard a noise from above. The guards had clearly started combing the floors. Leah stayed a little behind, checking the map, and Mark, despite his condition, brought up the rear of their formation, covering the rear. The tunnel was behind a massive steel door. Leah attached the key card, but nothing happened. The red indicator of the flashing lamp only increased their panic. "Why isn't it working?" she whispered, tapping the card again. "Maybe the card is invalid for this level," Mark suggested, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Or some other authentication is needed." John sighed, looking back at the hallway. "Then that leaves Plan B." He took out a cutter from the backpack he had brought with him and began to cut the lock. Sparks flew to the sides, and the noise of cutting seemed to rattle all over the floor. "They'll hear us," Caitlin warned, straining to listen to the noises around her. "Otherwise we won't get out," John said, working hard. The metal slowly gave way when footsteps were heard in the distance. "They're here," Mark whispered, picking up the wrench. "Done," gasped John, pulling back the sawed, off lock. He pushed open the door, and a narrow tunnel leading down opened in front of them. "Hurry inside." The group burst into the tunnel, closing the door behind them. They kept moving until the noise from above died down. The walls were wet and the floor was slippery, but John drove them forward until the tunnel ended with another door. This time it's an ordinary one, without locks. When they got outside, they were greeted by the cold night air. There was a dense forest thicket outside the tunnel. John took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline drain away. "We did it," Caitlin whispered, looking up at the stars. "No, it's not over yet," John replied gloomily. "We have to stop them from harming others." Leah silently handed him the folder she had taken out of the lab. "Here is our evidence. If we bring this to someone influential, their project will be shut down. And if we get caught on the way," asked Mark, leaning heavily on a tree. "Then at least we'll try," John said firmly. The group moved into the forest, knowing that there were many more challenges ahead. But they were sure of one thing: these monsters in white coats would pay for everything they had done.